Hello, everybody. This is George Buscemi from Québec-Vie, and this is Culture of Life. So today we're going to have news about priests and laity confronting a satanic mass in Ottawa. We're going to talk about Georgia and their new law against abortion and how it was challenged by the ACLU and others. We're going to talk about Roberto de Mattei commenting on the evisceration of the John Paul II Institute for Life and Family. We're going to talk about the Mother Cabrini statue that was refused in New York City, that and much more, so stay tuned. So first off, 7 priests and over 100 Catholics pray outside the satanic Black Mass in Ottawa. So this is from LifeSite News. There were 7 priests and over 120 Catholics praying outside a heavy metal bar called The Coven Saturday night. This was before August 19th. As a satanic Black Mass took place inside, the Catholics met on the steps of Notre Dame Cathedral, about 5 minutes from the Coven, where Ottawa's Archbishop Terence Prendergast and Auxiliary Bishop Guy Desrochers of Cornwall blessed them before they set out on their vigil, as reported by Catholic News World. So the Mass, quote-unquote, the Satanic Mass, was organized by National Director of the Satanic Temple in Canada, Nicholas Mark. And they sold about 50 tickets for it, and it began at 10 p.m. So Prendergast denounced the Black Mass as quote-unquote hateful and urged Catholics to pray in reparation for it. And so he said to tamper with and mock the Mass, which is what the satanic ritual does, is hateful and will affect more than those who participate in it. So this is good news in general, meaning that there's this resistance of Catholics and the bishops. They mobilized against this event. Black Mass is basically a Catholic Mass in reverse. And then they have to blaspheme and desecrate the Eucharist. It's normally done with a consecrated host, meaning the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ is desecrated, sometimes sexually or in other ways, during the course of this so-called Black Mass. So they basically do the opposite of what a Mass is. A Mass is to consecrate the bread into the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, so as to worship Him, and then you take the Eucharist into you so as to divinize the person so that you can go out into the world and communicate the love of Christ in the world. They do the opposite in a Black Mass. They desecrate the Eucharist so as to cut off any link from any moral constraint, any obligation towards God, and Satan becomes their prince, and that means they are free, quote unquote, to do what they want. Do what thou wilt. That is the whole of the law. That's what Satanists believe. So during a Black Mass, normally they have a consecrated host. Now, in this particular Mass, there was no consecrated host. So it wasn't technically a real Black Mass, but I think they went through the motions of doing everything else. And I found it a great move by the local Catholics of resisting it, of being out there. 120 of them were praying outside of the Mass itself. And so that's good. I just find that it's also ridiculous how we tolerate this kind of thing. And it really shows the limits of cultural relativism. What we call multiculturalism in Canada today is actually moral relativism run amok. You can't accept all religions, nor can you accept all cultures, because they are mutually exclusive. Some religions say it's good to help your neighbor. Other religions say it's good to kill your neighbor. You can't accept both. There has to be a hierarchy of religions, just like there has to be a hierarchy of cultures. Some cultures promote female mutilation, genital mutilation. Some promote other abhorrent practices. You can't put them on a par with other cultures. You have to have a hierarchy. You have to discriminate. But today we can't seem to be able to discriminate. We can't be able to think, and that's the problem. So religious liberty, so-called, without limits, is ridiculous because it allows for relativism. It allows for people, their brains to turn to mush, to be unable to say something is evil because that wouldn't be kind or polite, and you have to say that everybody's beliefs are good, when that is false. It's patently false. In a sane country, you would not allow such a mass or in such a format. You might allow discussions about, the truth of Christianity or the truth of different religions, and a debate to be had so that people can understand whether or not these beliefs are grounded in reason. That could be had, but to overtly desecrate something holy should not be allowed. And now it is allowed, and it's becoming more and more common. And we see with pride, I was going to say pride masses, but pride parades, LGBT parades, they want to put forward that evil is good. And that's what a black mass does ultimately. It shows that the greatest evil possible is a good. It's what allows for freedom. And that's what LGBT marches do as well. All this is born out of a spirit of moral relativism, that there is no true right or wrong, that everything is up for grabs. And that's what we are fostering today. That's what we have to fight against. So I think that this is a good move by the local Catholics of Ottawa, one thing. But second thing is we have to really re-examine the whole notion of religious liberty and the idea that all religions should be given pride of place. Well, that means that Satanism has to be given pride of place. And I think that's a reductio ad absurdum of religious liberty. Real religious liberty involves tolerating error so that people could be brought to truth. And this is not it. This is just craziness, and it has to stop. So we have to have a limit somewhere, and we have to start talking about where we put these limits. Next news story. Killing a living unborn child is not health care, Georgia declares. So this is out of LifeSite News. As Georgia fights to defend the legality of its ban on aborting babies with beating hearts, State Attorney General Chris Carr took the opportunity to affirm that Georgia does not recognize abortion as a legitimate form of medical practice. And so the filing was a motion opposing the so-called American Civil Liberties Union Center for Reproductive Rights and Planned Parenthood's request for an injunction to block the law that was put in place recently. So recently, Georgia had enacted the heartbeat bill, heartbeat legislation, which prohibits abortions on babies with beating hearts. So any kind of unborn child with a discernible heartbeat cannot be aborted in Georgia. And so that's the law of the land. It's being contested, obviously, by the abortionists. And Carr, resisting the call to suspend the law, answers, well, in Georgia, it's not even health care. It's not considered legitimate health care to kill a baby before it's born. And I can't believe we're even arguing this. It shows the state of society today that we're discussing whether killing a baby before birth is health care. Of course it's not health care because it doesn't give health, it gives death. Death is not health care. But now we allow the death of babies, and then recently it's the death of human beings through suicide that's called health care, euthanasia. And so I think that we have to push back really hard against this so-called health care that people are pushing, this reproductive health, and say that no, abortion is not health care. And furthermore, since it's not healing anything, we shouldn't be made to pay for it, because in many jurisdictions, like in Ontario and Quebec, everywhere in Canada, the money that's used to pay for these baby killings is actually coming out of the taxpayers' pockets. So not only is it allowed, but we're forced to pay for it. And so we should put our foot down and say it's not health care. It's if that person is going to have an abortion, at least don't make me pay for it. It's not health care. Call it something else. What it is it's hiring a hitman. This is something Pope Francis himself said. Abortion is like hiring a hitman to kill your offspring. And it's just a specialized form of assassination that requires special tools, but it's still the assassination of a child, a human being. And so bravo for Georgia, and I hope they stay firm. They look pretty solid, so that is great news. Next news item, in Italy, where they're having a political meltdown, as they do very often in that country. So the rosary emerges as a political football in Italy's latest meltdown. This is by John Allen Jr. in Crux magazine. He's talking about how the alliance between the two leading parties of Italy has broken down. So up till recently, there were two dominant parties in Italy's political scene, the Lega party and then the Five Star movement. So the Five Star movement is a populist kind of left-leaning party, environmentalist and so on. And the Lega is more of a right-wing anti-immigration party. And to govern, they had to cooperate, and they had to elect a prime minister, choose one, designate one, and his name was Giuseppe Conte. And recently, things weren't going very well in that marriage of convenience, and so Salvini decided to say, well, I'm breaking this off, my poll numbers are great, and so you guys get lost, and I'm gonna let the Italians decide who runs the country. So they're going back to elections. Now, so that means Conte, Giuseppe Conte, who was prime minister, has to resign, in which he did. And in his resignation speech, he made a few comments about Salvini's habit of kissing his rosary and of brandishing it during press conferences and other official functions. So he, in his speech, this is what he said. He was addressing Salvini directly. Salvini was just to his right as Conte was speaking, and so he was right there, and Salvini was making faces and reacting. But so Conte said the following: someone with responsibility for government should avoid juxtaposing political slogans with religious symbols during the rallies. Dear Matteo, such behavior, in my opinion, has nothing to do with the principle of religious liberty or freedom of conscience. It's religious recklessness, which risks offending the sentiments of believers and at the same time obscuring the principle of secularism, a fundamental trait of the modern state. I find that extremely important to note, because I think that secularism, though it is actually a fundamental trait of the modern state, I think it's a mistake. And I think that the church never taught it as a strict separation of church and state. So today, what we have in all Western states, almost to the last one, at least in practice, is a de facto separation of church and state. And it is considered necessary that this separation be had so as to allow religious freedom, so as to allow everybody to do as their conscience dictates. We have to separate religion and the state. That's the argument. The church has never argued that, and even logic dictates against that point of view. Why? Because when you're running a state or running any social body, you have to have a conception of the common good. You have to understand what it is that you're running for. What are you doing? What are your objectives? And the only way you can have an objective, for example, what are we doing here as a government? What's our role? And so on and so forth. Well, the only way you can have that is by having a global perspective on what it is to be human and what the human's goal is in life. If you say that the human's goal in life is to go to heaven, that's their goal, well, then you'll have a different conception of what ought or ought not be done. Whereas if somebody says, no, the human being is just a mass of matter that dissipates after death and there's nothing afterwards, well, then you'll have a more atheistic conception of life, and you won't have the same considerations. Or if you're an agnostic and you say, well, we can't know what happens after death, or we can't know that God exists, then you'll say, well, therefore we shouldn't talk about it in public. It should just be a private thing. Well, none of these things, none of these three possibilities are neutral. Whether you're agnostic, atheistic, or theistic, none of these are neutral. But the agnostics pretend they are neutral, and that's what I find dishonest. So right now, all the Western countries, after the so-called Enlightenment, they wanted to divide church from state. Really what they wanted to do, and what they did, was they divided the Catholic Church from the state. And what took the Catholic Church's place is a new ideology based on agnosticism. You could call it whatever, a Freemasonic kind of attitude where everything is acceptable except we'll not talk about religion. That was basically the Freemasons' modus operandi. And that's not neutral. That's Freemasonic. That's got nothing to do with neutrality. So when they talk about the neutrality of the state, it's just smoke. It's smoke to distract us from the fact that every state requires an ideology, an anthropology. That means a notion of what man is, who he is, and what his goal in life is, and what we're here on this planet for. And then once you have that, you can make decisions. That's necessary for the running of a state. Otherwise, why, whether explicit or implicit, you will have this ideology. And now, I think it's time that this kind of reasoning is debunked. You cannot pretend that religious liberty will be protected by neutrality, because neutrality is strictly impossible. And second of all, liberty is a means and not an end, meaning you are free in order to do something, but that thing that you want to do has to be good. And the only way you know what good or evil is if you have this kind of worldview. So that worldview could be Catholicism, it could be Protestant Christianity, it could be atheism, communism, or like I said, agnosticism, which is what the ideology today is, I think. But religious liberty only works within the framework of an ideology that's worked out. It's already embedded into it. So you can't just say that religious liberty is an end in itself. Liberty is an end in itself. No, it's a means. We're free because we want to find truth. We want to know the good. We want to pursue happiness. That's why we're given freedom. But we can abuse freedom as well. And everybody knows that freedom is not absolute. Religious liberty is not absolute either. Somebody whose religion asks that we sacrifice human beings, well, that religion will not make the cut for obvious reasons. So there's always a limit. And who draws that limit? Well, the state religion. But we can't call it that because we're not supposed to have a state religion. Well, here's the news flash. We do have a state religion, and let's be honest about it and define it and ask ourselves whether it's true, whether it's the true religion. That's what we have to do. That's the homework we have to do. And that's the only way where we'll get a culture of life. A culture of life requires a culture of truth, not a culture of moral relativism and dishonesty. So I thought that was an important point to make. Next story now, it's out of Ottawa again. Parents boo as Christian street preacher confronts drag queen at story time. LifeSite News reports the drag queen story time's question and answer session didn't go as planned. After the event at Westcliff Community Centre in Ottawa on a Saturday, evangelical street preacher Dor Love responded to an invitation for questions. "I have a question," Love said. "What are you going to do when you stand before God and he judges every one of you here for your sins?" So obviously after having said that, the room exploded into boos because he was ruining the buzz of this drag queen's performance. So a video published on Facebook shows the surprised, unhappy faces of a few parents and Russian-Canadian drag performer Adriana Expose, as well as a small number of children. And then, so the preacher then said, "The Bible says this, but if anyone causes one of my little ones to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone around their neck." So a very controversial moment, confrontational moment. I just find it insane that this is even happening. Again, when you see the video, you see this person with these thigh-high leather boots, 6-inch stilettos, dancing around in front of babies. What the heck is that? That's craziness. That's absolute insanity. I can't even believe it's happening, but it is. It's like watching a science fiction movie and then realizing it's not a movie. It's news. It's what's happening today. So this is in the context of a Ottawa-wide gay pride festival week. So now it's no longer gay pride parade where you have one day and it's the parade and that's it. Now it's a whole week sponsored by a big slew of corporations and government, different levels of government, from city all the way on up. And it's these week-long festivals where they have events at different venues. They have story time, drag queen hour at this and that and the other venue and so on. So this is one of these things. Now I'm speaking to Christians and Catholics who may be worried about imposing their religion on the public square. Well, look at what's happening here. These people are militantly promoting their religion in the public square. It's the LGBT ideology. It has a vision of what man is. I think that LGBT people view the human being as a pack of molecules and nothing more, that we can rearrange at will, and that the mind or spirit has nothing to do with your body. Your body is completely divorced from your mind. And so if I am a man on the inside, I can be a woman on the outside, or nothing on the outside. I could be a machine or whatever. There's no connection. And that's their belief, and they're pushing it. And they're pushing it through song and dance for shows, in processions down the street with their parades, with contraception, which is part of the LGBT ideology, and abortion, which is a sacrament of the LGBT ideology. And so they have the full package, and they're evangelizing 24/7. They're in the schools, they're on TV, they're organizing these week-long festivals, they're in the banks, and they're in academia, obviously. So what are we doing? We're just kind of trembling in our pews. We have to get out, like those people in Ottawa did in front of the Black Mass. But every day, in a given abortion clinic, there's about 20 abortions, which is worse or just as bad as a Black Mass, where they kill a baby. In these abortion clinics, they give the baby as a sacrifice to Baal, the god of liberty. So where are the Christians in front of clinics? Very few people participate in the 40 Days for Life or other things like that. We have to be active. We have to think about what they're doing. We have to oppose it. We have to be out there. Next news item now. Roberto De Mattei wrote a very good article entitled, "The John Paul II Institute Has Fallen, but Has It Fallen with Honor?" So to give a little background on this, John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, one of his biggest legacies was the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family. Now, these are universities or institutions that are based in universities, and there's several campuses around the world, and their main objective is to disseminate church teaching on life and family and marriage. So basically, they're trying to communicate to the modern world church teaching with respect to issues that are very hard for the modern world to accept, like the prohibition against contraception, the prohibition against abortion, and out of wedlock sex, and all these things. Basically, they're trying to show the modern world that it's not just these arbitrary prohibitions, but that there's an anthropology behind it. That our no to all these things like contraception or abortion are the result of a greater yes. That it's a yes to the man and the woman as realities, not this kind of, men and women are not Play-Doh that you can fashion at will. It's actually part of our identity, being male or female. And so if we engage in contraceptive sex, it's like you're lying. You're lying to your spouse, or you're lying to your partner. You're not giving to the fullness of yourself to the other. And so this is what they call the theology of the body by John Paul II. And this is what they taught at this institute. But the other thing that they taught, just before we go on to this article, the other thing that they taught was that moral relativism was wrong. Is that meaning not all is shades of gray. There are some things that are bad at all times and for all people. So it is always wrong, for example, to kill an innocent human being. So that's why the prohibition against abortion holds for all cases, even rape, and so on and so forth. It is always wrong to engage in homosexual acts. It's what they call intrinsically evil. And there are many, many of these intrinsic evils. And so John Paul II wrote an encyclical called Veritatis Splendor, and it affirmed the immemorial church teaching that it doesn't depend on the situation. Sometimes acts are wrong in and of themselves, and it doesn't matter what the situation is, they're wrong. So intrinsically evil. So there's such a thing as intrinsically evil acts. And that's what was affirmed in Veritatis Splendor. Now along comes Pope Francis with his exhortation, Joy of Love, or what's the name? The name escapes me. The Joy of Love, of married love. So he wrote this exhortation after 2 synods on the family. And if you look at the chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, that's the title in Latin, The Joy of Married Love. Amoris Laetitia in chapter 8, and we look at paragraph 300, 301, 302, 303, it seems to be a direct refutation or contradiction with John Paul II's Veritatis Splendor. He wants to say that, well, no, it's not like that. There's some acts that, though they may seem intrinsically evil, for the person doing it at that time, God wills that they do it like that because they're not ready to go and reach the ideal. So let's say somebody is in a second marriage. They're therefore in a situation of adultery because their first marriage was not declared null. So they're actually all married to somebody else, but they left that person and they remarried. So now they're in a state of adultery. And normally, Catholic teaching would say something like, well, if you guys can't separate physically because you have kids, for example, at least don't engage in sex and just live as brother and sister. Now, what seems to be said in Amoris Laetitia is that some people find that impossible, and so they'll keep on having sexual relations, but those people should still be granted communion because God understands that they can't do what the church teaches, and so God will let them continue with adultery because they're trying their best, quote unquote. I'm paraphrasing, but that's, I believe, is the essence of a paragraph like 303 in Amoris Laetitia. Now that just contradicts flatly Veritatis Splendor. And so the institution that embodied that encyclical, the John Paul II Academy Institute for Marriage and Family, well, that institution had to go, and that's what happened to it. It has been demolished. All the top, most eminent professors who were following these encyclicals of John Paul II's, they're gone. And Roberto de Mattei, his contribution to this whole debate is that he tells the story of two groups after Vatican II. So out of Vatican II, there was two kind of streams of Catholic thought. One was progressive, extreme left, and they wanted to just change everything and make the Catholic Church into the Democratic Party in the US, basically. Pro-abortion, pro-gay marriage, pro-everything. So that was that group. And then there was a kind of a moderate group that wanted to keep church morality as it was. And so out of that moderate group, you could include Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, now Benedict XVI, and John Paul II and others. And what de Mattei says is that those two groups were fighting all along for supremacy up until today. But the problem is that the conservatives had 30 years from 1978, which is John Paul II's beginnings, all the way up to 2013 when Benedict XVI resigned. But they had all that time to purge the universities and the episcopate of all these extreme progressives and these basically non-Catholics who were constantly calling for reversal of church teachings. They could have took them all away, got rid of them, and they didn't. So he asks the question, well, you got what you deserved. Haven't you gotten what you deserved? Kind of these soft conservatives, haven't you gotten what you deserved? And it's a bit like in politics. There's this kind of left and right dichotomy, and they just help each other out. Or rather, the left seems to always be making progress every time they have a term. It's like in Canada. You know, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he legalizes abortion. He legalizes gay sex, contraception. That's in 1969. And then there's a few conservative governments, and it goes back and forth. And then Justin Trudeau comes in, and he takes another chunk. And so Canada keeps going left, left, left. We either pause and don't go left during a conservative mandate, and then when the left comes in again, we slide even further. So we never seem to make progress towards the good. Instead of right, I'd just say upward. We never go upward. We're always going down. So it's that the right doesn't actually fight. They just fight for the status quo, whereas they should be fighting to win. But the left fights to win. And so the left gets progress made, and the right never makes progress. It just stays or loses. And now we're seeing that it's losing big time. For 30 years, the conservatives in the church had the upper hand. They had their Pope, and they had Cardinal Ratzinger as the chief of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. So they could have purged a lot of universities. They could have gotten rid of a lot of bishops, retired them, and so on and so forth. But they were very, I don't know, very wary of doing anything. And now here we are, 30 years later, and boom, it's 1977 again. It's the crazy 70s where everything is open up. So Desmarais just says, we should be doing like Pius X. When he had modernists, he just took them and got them out of there. Fired, you're fired, you're fired. He would call a bishop and just say, leave your little hat right here, you're gone. So we should be tougher with these heretics. Next up, Czech primate supports Polish bishop criticizing LGBT. So this is the follow-up to the news of when the Polish bishops talked about the LGBT ideology and condemned it. And it's in reaction to when the Bishop of Krakow declared that the LGBT ideology was similar to the red ideology that took Poland over in the past. So basically, he's comparing the LGBT ideology to communism, and it is. It's a false and evil ideology on the level of communism, and the victims of today's crazy ideology are the unborn by the thousands and millions, and that's where the victims are today. The victims of communism are a bit older, and they also caused legalized abortion, by the way. The communists were among the first to legalize abortion soon after the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. So it's interesting to see, again, the parallels between politics and church matters. So in the political realm, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland form a coalition against the pro-abort European Union. And so in church matters, they're also a coalition. So when the Polish bishops do something and they need help and support, well, the Czech bishop will pipe up, and the Hungarian one, I believe, also commented positively about what the Polish bishops did here. So it's great to see these Episcopal conferences in Eastern Europe fight with each other and fight the LGBT ideology, which is a deadly and evil ideology. Next up now, the New York City Arts Program rejects Mother Cabrini for statue. This is from CNA. This news is out of the website called CNA. So it's a New York City public arts program that wants to encourage people to build, or that wants to have more women statues in New York City. So Mayor Bill de Blasio, his wife, is running this committee, this project, to build women statues, because there's just too many men, white males, dead white males, and they wanted some females to kind of underline the contributions of women in New York City, in building New York City. So they had a public poll to get some feedback from the public to see, who should we be commemorating, whose statues should we be building, and so they got 2,000 votes, and 219 nominations were for Mother Cabrini. So Mother Cabrini is a 19th century nun who founded orphanages and schools in New York City, and she got the most votes by far, because the votes were divided between very many candidates. And so it's unfortunate because what happened is that they rejected the Mother Cabrini statue, saying that, well, it's not what we're looking for. But what they did accept is 2 transgender people, so 2 men pretending to be women. They got accepted as statues of women for this project. So we see, keep on saying that there's a separation of religion and the state. Well, there's this crazy ideology. You may as well call it a religion. It's a ideology that has an understanding of what man is and their destiny in life and what the goal of life is. And they're pushing their ideology on the public, in the public sphere. These people are not hesitating to push their agenda. So why aren't we pushing ours? So this has been New York is a completely liberal area. They're completely pro-abortion. Mario Cuomo is the governor there, and he just enacted a pro-abortion bill that allows abortions past birth. In case a child is born accidentally, you're allowed to euthanize it in New York State. So this is the state of things in New York State, and New York City is no better. So it's a sad thing indeed. Next news now, no more than 2 parents per child confirms appeal court in Quebec. This is news from La Presse. What's interesting about this news is that it's an appeal court result. And so in this particular situation, what was being judged was whether 3 parents should be allowed as identified as parents of this one child. So basically the situation was that there were 2 lesbians who were married, quote unquote, and they enlisted a 3rd person, a man, to donate his sperm so that one of them could be pregnant and then deliver a child. So at first, the 2 lesbians were the parents, quote unquote, and recognized as such by the government. And then what happened is that there was a breakup, and the lesbians broke up, and then the biological father wanted to be recognized as the father, which he was after the breakup. And so then it was the biological mother with the biological father. They were recognized as mother and father. And the lesbian that was left out of the whole thing, she complained. She wants to be the 3rd parent. She wants to be recognized as parent number 3. So she went to court, and now that just got refused. But something tells me that this is going to go to the Supreme Court. And the way the article in La Presse is written, and the way the decision is presented, it's written in such a way that the Supreme Court won't have any trouble reversing that decision and allowing 3-parent designations. And that seems to be the way it's going. Because once the state redefines marriage, as it did in, I believe, 2005, when gay marriage was allowed in Canada. So now the state can just say what marriage is. Because normally a natural marriage is when a man and a woman get together in view of forming a family. That's what marriage is. So 2 males can't produce kids. So that's why their union cannot be called marriage. But the state decided to impose its definition of marriage on everybody. So now the state gets to call whatever it wants marriage. Once that happens, now the state will have the power to call whomever it wants parent. So it has the power over marriage. Well, it has the power over parenthood, does it not? And so that's the next step in this cultural revolution. And I think it's only a matter of months till we hear this Supreme Court ruling. I would be very surprised if they upheld this appeals court ruling. finally, the last news story is Mother Miriam, who states that she's against public schools and that we have to get our kids out of public school ASAP. This is news out of LifeSite News. And they have a regular show with Mother Miriam, who speaks live. Mother Miriam Live is the name of the show. And they recently had one where she was describing a book, recently published book, about getting your kids out of public school as being an emergency, as being essential today. Why? Well, the arguments are that it's way too toxic. It's toxic at the level of sexuality. There's aggressive, drag queen-esque sex ed courses. These and the aggressively relativistic ethics courses, citizenship courses. In Quebec, they're called ethics and religious culture courses. So basically what they ram down the kid's throat is that there is no absolute moral truth, and that everything is constructed, and you have to elaborate your own truth. You kind of have to pick out the best elements of whatever you hear around you, and that's the best you can do. You cobble something together, and that's what you do. You do that through dialogue. That's the ideology. Morality is subjective. You build it up in community. You get consensus. Whatever consensus happens to be is what morality is. So I suppose then, following that logic, that 1933 Germany were completely okay with what they did, because they built up consensus, and their consensus was that they had to resolve the Jewish question with ovens. If that's what they determined, who are we to judge, right? Well, that seems to be what moral relativism is, and they can't get out of that thought, but that's what they push. So the moral relativism is deadly. It's deadly poison to the mind and to the spirit. And the degeneracy of sex ed make it such that we got to get the kids out of public schools. They're indoctrination camps. And so Mother Miriam is bang on. We have to be vigilant. So either we find a good private school or we do homeschooling. And lots of people do homeschooling. It's not easy, but there's help out there. There's the Homeschool Legal Defense Association and other organizations that help homeschoolers network and find judicial or legal help if they need it when they confront different levels of government that are trying to persecute homeschoolers. Because obviously, if the government wants to indoctrinate your kids, then they want to make sure that the kids actually show up to their schools. So they're not going to like this homeschool movement, and they're going to find all sorts of excuses to make homeschooling difficult. And they're doing that more and more in Quebec by putting more and more administrative hurdles in front of the parents, many more reports, testing, and so on. It's a lot harder to do homeschooling than it could be, but it's still worth it to protect your kids from the ideologies that are polluting schools today. It's almost a necessity now that you got to pull your kids out of there. In Ontario, they have the so-called Catholic school system, but it's not much better than the public. It's funded by the public purse, and so they're completely beholden to the system for their money. So they're going to just listen to what the minister will say, and so it's not a good situation. The public Catholic school system in Ontario is next to worthless. So alternatives have to be found, whether they're private schools or homeschooling. The time is now to pull your kids out, because like Mother Miriam says, you can't redo childhood. So I hope you enjoyed today's show, and I hope to see you in at least 2 weeks, maybe shorter time. So in the meantime, God bless. See you soon.